The flickering fluorescent light above the sink hummed a nervous tune, each stutter a small electric gasp in the otherwise silent bathroom. Liam stared at his reflection, but the face looking back felt like a stranger's. Tired, pale, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and not enough good news. He splashed cold water on his face. The shock of it, a welcome distraction from the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He was late on rent, again. The stack of textbooks on his small desk seemed to mock him, their glossy covers a reminder of the tuition fees he was struggling to pay. He'd been scrolling through job listings for hours, the same soul-crushing parade of unpaid internships and minimum wage gigs that wouldn't even cover his grocery bill. Then he saw it, a listing that was different. It was for a night custodian at a private archival facility. The pay was substantial. More than substantial, it was suspicious. The requirements were vague, almost cryptic. A strong adherence to protocol, it said, nothing else. No mention of experience, no demand for a long list of skills. Just that one simple phrase. A quiet unease prickled at the back of his neck, but the number on the screen was a powerful sedative. He applied. He had to. The response was immediate. An email, brief and to the point, inviting him for an interview the next day. The interview itself was even stranger. It was held in a small, windowless room, the air thick with the smell of old paper and something else, something he couldn't quite place. The interviewer, a man with a face like a clenched fist, didn't ask him about his work history or his grades. He just stared at him, his eyes small and dark, and spoke in a low, monotone voice about the importance of rules. "We are a facility of order, Mr. Henderson," he'd said, his fingers steepled on the desk in front of him. "Everything has its place. Everything has its procedure. You are to follow the protocols without question. Do you understand?" Liam, desperate and a little intimidated, had simply nodded. "Good," the man had said, a flicker of something that might have been a smile touching his lips. "You start tomorrow." Liam's first night was a study in silence. The archival facility was a vast, sterile labyrinth of white walls and polished concrete floors, the air chilled to a constant low temperature. The silence was the first thing that struck him. It wasn't just quiet, it was a heavy, oppressive absence of sound that seemed to press in on him from all sides. His supervisor, a gaunt and serious man named Elias, walked him through the building, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls. He pointed out the color-coded zones, the emergency exits, the intricate network of security cameras that watched their every move. He handed Liam a simple list of tasks: sweeping, mopping, emptying trash cans, and a single laminated card. It was white with black block letters that read, "Emergency Protocol." Elias's explanation was brief, almost dismissive. "The lights are reliable," he said, his voice flat. "State-of-the-art system. You'll never need the protocol." He tapped the card with a long, bony finger. "But if you do, you follow it. To the letter. No questions, no hesitation." He looked at Liam then, his eyes holding a strange intensity. "This is not a job for creative thinkers, Mr. Henderson. This is a job for followers." And with that, he was gone, leaving Liam alone in the vast, silent expanse of the facility. The silence, once just an absence of noise, now felt like a presence. It filled the empty spaces, clung to the high ceilings, and seemed to watch him from the long, dark corridors that branched off in every direction. He tried to shake off the feeling, to focus on the simple, mindless tasks he'd been given. He swept the floors, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a small, defiant sound against the overwhelming quiet. He emptied the trash cans, the crinkle of the plastic bags unnaturally loud in the stillness. But the feeling of being watched, of being an intruder in a place that did not want him there, never left. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, his eyes drawn to the dark, unlit corners of the facility. He'd catch a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed to shift and writhe just out of sight. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there, just the cold, sterile emptiness of the archives. He told himself it was just his imagination, his mind playing tricks on him in the unfamiliar, unsettling environment. But as the hours ticked by, the feeling only grew stronger, the silence more profound, the shadows deeper and more menacing. He was starting to understand that this wasn't just a job. It was a vigil, and he was the one on watch. A few nights in, the initial unease began to fade, replaced by a dull, monotonous routine. The silence was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface of things, but Liam was learning to ignore it. He put in his earbuds, turn up the music, and lose himself in the simple, repetitive tasks of his shift. Sweep, mop, empty trash. The vast, sterile facility was becoming familiar, its long corridors and color-coded zones no longer a source of anxiety, but simply a map of his nightly rounds. He was starting to think that maybe Elias was right. Maybe it was just a job, a strange, well-paying job, but a job nonetheless. Then came the flicker. He was in the blue zone, a long, cavernous hall lined with towering shelves of archival boxes. He was halfway down the corridor when the lights at the far end blinked out. One moment they were there, a steady, unwavering glow, and the next they were gone, plunging the end of the hall into a deep, impenetrable darkness. A beat of silence, and then they were back, as bright and steady as before. But in that brief moment of darkness, a cold, primal fear had seized him. It was a feeling he hadn't felt since he was a child, a raw, unreasoning terror that came from the deepest, most ancient part of his brain. He stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes fixed on the spot where the lights had gone out. There was nothing there. Just the same long, empty corridor he'd been cleaning for the past week. He told himself it was a power surge, a faulty wire, a simple, logical explanation for a simple, logical event. But the feeling of dread, the sense of a vast and terrible wrongness, lingered. He tried to shake it off, to get back to work, but his hands were trembling, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He finished his shift in a state of heightened alert, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, his ears straining for any sound that was out of place. The silence, which he had grown accustomed to, was once again a source of menace, a canvas on which his imagination could paint its darkest fears. He left the facility that night with a sense of relief. The cool night air, a welcome balm on his frayed nerves. But as he walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that something from the deep, dark corners of the archives had attached itself to him, a silent, unseen passenger on his journey back to the world of the living. The flickering became a regular occurrence, a nightly punctuation mark in the long, silent sentence of his shift. It was never in the same place twice, a random, unpredictable event that kept him in a constant state of low-grade anxiety. He'd be mopping a floor, and a light down the hall would blink out. He'd be emptying a trash can, and the lights in the room next door would die for a moment. It was always brief, just a second or two of darkness, but it was enough to keep him on edge, to remind him of the deep, primal fear he'd felt that first time. His curiosity, a trait he'd been warned against, began to gnaw at him. He found himself thinking about the laminated card Elias had given him, the one with the emergency protocol. He'd kept it in his locker, a forgotten relic of his first night. Now it felt like a key, a clue to the mystery that was slowly unfolding around him. One night, after a particularly unsettling series of flickers, he retrieved the card and read it. The instructions were simple, direct, and utterly bizarre. 1. If the lights go out, do not move. 2. Close your eyes. 3. Count to 100 slowly. 4. Do not open your eyes until you have finished counting, no matter what you hear. 5. If the lights are still out after you finish counting, do not speak. 6. Proceed to the nearest safe room marked in red. Do not run. 7. Do not look at any of the archival shelves. 8. Do not make a sound. He read the list again, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. This was not a standard emergency procedure. This was something else. This was a ritual, a set of rules for a game he didn't understand. The last 3 rules were the ones that chilled him the most. Do not look at any of the archival shelves. Do not make a sound. What was on the shelves that he wasn't supposed to see? What was listening in the darkness that he wasn't supposed to alert? The questions echoed in the silence of his mind, each one a small, sharp jab of fear. He put the card back in his pocket, the smooth, laminated surface a cold, hard reminder of the strange and terrifying reality of his new job. He was no longer just a custodian. He was a guardian, a watchman at the edge of a dark and unknown territory, and he was starting to realize that the flickering lights were not a malfunction. They were a warning. The main power cut out with a sudden, definitive thud. One moment, the facility was bathed in the steady, sterile glow of the fluorescent lights, and the next, it was plunged into a darkness so complete, so absolute, that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. The emergency lights, the ones Elias had assured him were state-of-the-art, failed to engage. There was no flicker, no warning, just a sudden, terrifying plunge into the abyss. Liam's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat in the sudden, oppressive silence. He was in the green zone, a vast, open space in the center of the facility. He was miles from any of the safe rooms. A tiny, insignificant figure in a vast, dark ocean. The protocol. The words flashed in his mind, a lifeline in the swirling chaos of his fear. If the lights go out, do not move. Close your eyes. Count to 100, slowly. He squeezed his eyes shut, the darkness behind his eyelids, a pale imitation of the absolute blackness that surrounded him. He took a deep, shuddering breath and began to count. 1, 2, 3. His voice was a small, trembling whisper in the vast, empty space. The silence was the worst part. It was a living thing, a hungry, predatory entity that seemed to be listening, waiting. He tried to focus on the numbers, on the steady, rhythmic progression of his count, but his mind was a whirlwind of fear and speculation. What was out there in the darkness with him? What was on the shelves that he wasn't supposed to see? Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was a small sound, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there, a tiny sharp pinprick in the thick woolen blanket of the silence. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like a fingernail tapping on metal, and it was moving. He could hear it getting closer, the sound growing louder, more distinct with each tap. It was coming from his left, from the direction of the long, dark corridor that led to the blue zone. He wanted to run, to scream, to open his eyes and face whatever was coming for him. But the protocol held him fast, a set of invisible chains that bound him to the spot. Do not move. Do not open your eyes. He gritted his teeth, his body rigid with a mixture of fear and a strange, morbid curiosity. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it was right in front of him, just a few feet away. It stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound itself. He could feel a cold spot in the air, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He was not alone. The tapping had stopped, but the silence it left behind was a screaming void. Liam's voice was a raw, trembling thread in the oppressive darkness as he continued to count. 97, 98, 99. The cold spot in front of him was a palpable presence, a block of ice in the otherwise still air. He could feel it, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to radiate from a single point in the darkness. He imagined a figure standing there, a tall, gaunt shape with long, spindly fingers and eyes that glowed in the dark. He imagined it reaching out, its cold, dead hand about to touch his face. 100! The words were a choked gasp, a final, desperate exhalation of breath. He held his breath, his body rigid, his ears straining for any sound. Nothing. The silence was absolute, the cold spot gone. He slowly, cautiously opened his eyes. The darkness was as complete as it had been before. The lights were still out. The protocol, the next step. If the lights are still out after you finish counting, do not speak. Proceed to the nearest safe room, marked in red. Do not run. He took a slow, deliberate step, his hands outstretched, feeling his way through the disorienting blackness. The familiar layout of the facility was now a treacherous, unknown landscape. He shuffled forward, his feet sliding on the smooth, polished concrete. He had to get to the red zone, to the heavy, soundproof door of the safe room. It was his only hope, his only sanctuary in this vast, dark prison. He heard a sound behind him, a soft, wet, dragging sound. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like something heavy and sodden being pulled across the floor. He froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He wanted to turn, to look, to see what was making that terrible, gut-wrenching sound. But the protocol was a mantra in his mind, a shield against the rising tide of his terror. Do not look. Do not run. He forced himself to move, to put one foot in front of the other, to continue his slow, agonizing journey to the safe room. The dragging sound followed him, a constant, terrifying companion in the darkness. It was getting closer. He could hear it just a few feet behind him now, a wet, rasping sound that made his stomach churn. He was a mouse in a maze, and the cat was toying with him, letting him think he had a chance, letting him get close to the safety of his hole before it pounced. He could feel its breath on his neck, a cold, foul-smelling exhalation that made him want to retch. He was almost there. He could feel the wall of the red zone, the rough, textured surface, a welcome change from the smooth, cold concrete of the floor. He fumbled along the wall, his hands searching for the door, for the handle, for the promise of safety that lay beyond. The dragging sound stopped. He was right behind him. His fingers, numb with cold and fear, brushed against the cool, smooth metal of the archival shelves. The protocol, a relentless, unforgiving litany, screamed in his mind, "Do not look at any of the archival shelves." The words were a physical barrier, a wall of pure, unadulterated terror that stood between him and the shelves. But in the swirling chaos of his fear, a new, insidious emotion began to take root: curiosity. It was a morbid, self-destructive impulse, a desire to know what was so terrible that it had to be hidden away in the darkness. What secrets did these shelves hold? What horrors were contained within the rows upon rows of identical, anonymous boxes? The dragging sound behind him had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more menacing. He was awaiting silence, a predatory stillness that seemed to be daring him to look, to break the one rule that seemed to matter more than all the others. He could feel the pull of the shelves, a strange magnetic force that seemed to be drawing him closer. He imagined reaching out, his fingers closing around the edge of a box, pulling it from the shelf and opening it. What would he find inside? A skull? A shrunken head? Something worse? Something that defied description. Something that would shatter his sanity and leave him a gibbering, broken wreck. The thought was both terrifying and strangely alluring. It was the call of the void, the siren song of the abyss. He was a moth, and the shelves were aflame, a dark, cold flame that promised not light, but a final, all-consuming darkness. He gritted his teeth, his body trembling with the effort of resisting the urge. He was a follower, not a leader. A rule follower, not a rule breaker. He had to trust the protocol. He had to believe that it was there to protect him, not to torment him. He pulled his hand back from the shelf as if it had been burned. He turned his back on the shelves, on the dark, seductive promise of their secrets, and continued his slow, shuffling journey to the safe room. The dragging sound started again, a low, guttural growl of disappointment from the darkness behind him. It was angry. He had denied it its prize, and now it was no longer toying with him. It was hunting him. He finally found it, the heavy steel door of the safe room. His hands, clumsy and trembling, fumbled with the handle. It was cold, so cold it felt like it was burning his skin. He turned the handle, the click of the latch a gunshot in the oppressive silence. He pushed the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind him. He leaned against the door, his body racked with shudders, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He was safe. For now. The room was small, a perfect cube of reinforced concrete. There were no windows, no vents, no way for anything to get in or out. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh yellow light on the bare walls. He wasn't alone. A figure was huddled in the corner, their face buried in their knees. It was a young woman, her body trembling, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "You're the new guy," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The night custodian." Liam nodded, his own voice a dry, croaking sound in his throat. "Liam, Maya," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "I'm a daytime archivist. I was working late. I fell asleep." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "This has happened before, hasn't it?" Liam nodded again, his mind still reeling from the terror of the past hour. "The tapping," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The dragging sound. Maya's face went pale. "You heard it too?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The last one, the one before you, he heard it too. He didn't make it to the safe room." The words hung in the air between them, a cold, heavy weight. The previous night custodian, the one Elias had never mentioned, the one who had disappeared. "What's going on here, Maya?" Liam asked, his voice a little stronger now, a spark of anger cutting through the fear. "What is this place?" Maya looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, soul-weary sadness. "This isn't just an archive, Liam," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "It's a prison, and we're the guards." Maya's words hung in the small, sterile room, a chilling counterpoint to the steady, humming silence. "A prison?" Liam repeated, his voice a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "What are you talking about?" "What's in those boxes?" Maya hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected something to burst through the walls. "Not what?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who?" Or something like who? "They're not just documents, Liam. They're anomalous artifacts, things that don't make sense, things that shouldn't exist." She told him about the previous night custodian, a young man named Ben. He'd been a student just like Liam, trying to make some extra money. He'd been quiet, kept to himself. He'd been good at following the rules, but one night the power had gone out and Ben had disappeared. They found his flashlight in the blue zone, its beam still cutting a weak yellow circle on the floor. But there was no sign of Ben. No blood, no struggle, nothing. He was just gone. "They told us he quit," Maya said, her voice laced with a bitter, cynical edge. "They said he just walked out and never came back. But I know what happened to him. The same thing that almost happened to us." She looked at Liam, her eyes wide and serious. "The things on the shelves, Liam, they're not just objects, they're listeners. They feed on silence and darkness, and when the lights go out, they wake up." The word listener sent a fresh wave of cold dread through Liam. He thought of the tapping, the dragging, the cold spot in the air. He thought of the protocol, the strange, ritualistic set of rules that seemed designed to keep them from being heard. Do not speak. Do not make a sound. It all made a terrible, horrifying kind of sense now. They weren't just custodians, they were bait. They were the canaries in the coal mine, the sacrificial lambs offered up to the hungry, listening darkness. And the protocol wasn't a set of rules for their safety, it was a set of rules for the listeners' feeding. The power remained off, the single, bare bulb in the safe room their only shield against the encroaching darkness. Liam and Maya sat in silence, the weight of their shared knowledge, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The silence in the room was different from the silence outside. It was a tense, watchful silence, a silence that was pregnant with the possibility of sound. And then it came. A faint, whisper-thin sound from outside the door. It was a soft, sibilant sound, like the rustle of dry leaves or the hiss of a snake. It grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door, a chorus of whispers that seemed to be coming from all directions at once. The whispers were in a language neither of them understood, a guttural, clicking language that sounded ancient and alien. But the tone, the intent, was universal. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. The doorknob began to jiggle. It was a slow, deliberate movement at first, a gentle, exploratory rattle. Then it became more frantic, more violent, the metal knob twisting and turning with a furious, desperate energy. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, the guttural clicks and hisses rising to a fever pitch. It was a symphony of terror, a chorus of nightmares, and they were trapped in the front row. Liam and Maya huddled together in the corner, their bodies pressed against the cold, unyielding concrete. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The door, which had seemed so strong and impenetrable just a few moments ago, now felt like a flimsy, paper-thin barrier against the storm of sound and fury that was raging outside. The doorknob stopped jiggling. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was a deafening roar. They waited, their bodies tense, their breath held in their chests. What was it doing? Was it gone, or was it just waiting, listening, biding its time? The silence stretched on, each second an eternity. Liam could hear the frantic, panicked thumping of his own heart, a wild, terrified bird trapped in the cage of his ribs. He looked at Maya, her face a pale, ghostly mask in the harsh yellow light. Her eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored his own. They were two small, insignificant creatures, trapped in a box, at the mercy of a predator they could not see, could not understand, and could not fight. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was a threat. It was the calm before the storm, the deep, indrawn breath before the final, soul-shattering scream. Suddenly, with a loud electric hum, the lights flickered back on. The single bare bulb in the safe room seemed to dim for a moment, as if in deference to the sudden, overwhelming flood of light from the outside world. The silence, which had been a heavy, oppressive weight just a moment before, was now just silence. The whispers were gone. The doorknob was still. Liam and Maya stayed huddled in the corner, their bodies still tense, their ears still straining for any sound. They waited, listening, for what felt like an eternity. But there was nothing, just the low, steady hum of the fluorescent lights, a sound that had once been a source of annoyance but was now the most beautiful, most reassuring sound in the world. Cautiously, slowly, they untangled themselves from each other and stood up. Their legs were stiff, their muscles cramped from being held in the same position for so long. They looked at each other, a silent question passing between them. Was it over? Was it safe? Liam, his heart still pounding in his chest, took a tentative step towards the door. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cool, smooth metal of the doorknob. It was just a doorknob, a simple, inanimate object. But it had been the focus of so much terror, the focal point of their shared nightmare. He took a deep breath and turned the handle. The click of the latch was a small, insignificant sound in the vast, echoing silence of the facility. He pulled the door open and peered out. The corridor was empty. The lights were on. Everything was exactly as it had been before the outage. But it wasn't the same. The air was thick with a palpable sense of wrongness, a lingering, invisible residue of the terror that had just transpired. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker, more menacing. The silence, which had returned to its normal, low-grade hum, now felt like a thin, fragile veneer over a deep, dark abyss of sound and fury. They had survived, but they were not safe. They were just in the eye of the storm, a temporary lull in a battle that was far from over. And they both knew, with a cold, chilling certainty, that the storm would be back. The next few nights were a blur of fear and paranoia. Liam and Maya, bound together by their shared trauma, decided that they couldn't just go on as if nothing had happened. They had to know what they were up against. They had to know what was in those boxes. they began their investigation discreetly, cautiously, their every move shadowed by the fear of being discovered. During the day, Maya would use her access as an archivist to search the facility's digital records, looking for any mention of anomalous artifacts, the listener, or the previous night custodian, Ben. At night, Liam would continue his rounds, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, his ears straining for any sound that was out of place. He was no longer just a custodian. He was a sentinel, a guardian of a secret that was slowly, inexorably driving him mad. They found a series of incident reports, all heavily redacted, all mentioning power outages. The reports were dry, clinical, and utterly devoid of any real information. Incident occurred at 03:17 a.m. Power outage in Blue Zone. Protocol initiated. All clear at 04:22 a.m. It was a litany of bureaucratic doublespeak, a carefully constructed wall of words designed to conceal, not to reveal. But the dates, the times, the locations, they all corresponded with the flickering lights, with the power outages, with the moments of pure, unadulterated terror that had become a regular part of their lives. They were not random events. They were a pattern that was leading them closer and closer to the heart of the mystery, to the dark, terrifying truth that lay hidden in the archives. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were trying to understand. And they both knew, with a growing sense of dread, that the two were inextricably linked. To survive, they had to understand. And to understand, they had to risk everything. They finally found it, buried deep in a forgotten corner of the facility's server, a single, unredacted file. It was a digital ghost, a file that should have been deleted, a secret that should have remained buried. The file was labeled Acquisition Report 734. It was a dry, technical document, filled with scientific jargon and bureaucratic language. But as they read, a story began to emerge, a story that was far more terrifying than any ghost story they had ever heard. The report described the discovery of an artifact in a remote, unexplored cave system in the Amazon rainforest. The artifact was a small obsidian box, no bigger than a shoebox. It was smooth, black, and cold to the touch. The report described how the artifact seemed to absorb light and sound, how it created a small, localized field of silence and darkness around it. The report called it the listener. The report went on to describe the artifact's properties in more detail. It was a parasitic entity, a creature that fed on silence and darkness. It was dormant in the light, but in the dark, it would wake up. It could manipulate its environment, creating auditory and visual hallucinations, tapping into the deepest fears of those around it. It could imprint itself on those who heard it, creating a psychic link that would allow it to torment them even when they were miles away. The report ended with a stark, chilling warning. The artifact is not to be opened. It is not to be studied. It is to be contained at all costs. The words sent a shiver down Liam's spine. He thought of the tapping, the dragging, the whispers. He thought of the cold spot in the air, the feeling of being watched, the sense of a malevolent intelligence toying with him in the darkness. It was all real. It was all in the report. They were not just dealing with a ghost or a monster. They were dealing with an alien intelligence, a creature from another dimension, a thing that was so far beyond their understanding that it might as well have been a god, a dark, hungry, listening god, and they were its keepers. The knowledge of the listener was a poison. It seeped into their minds, tainting their thoughts, coloring their perceptions. The world, which had once been a place of light and sound, was now a place of shadows and whispers. They saw it everywhere, in the dark corners of their apartments, in the fleeting reflections in shop windows, in the faces of strangers on the street. They heard it in the silence between conversations, in the rustle of leaves in the wind, in the low, humming drone of the city at night. The paranoia was a constant low-grade fever, a persistent nagging ache in the back of their minds. They couldn't sleep, they couldn't eat. They were prisoners in their own minds, tormented by a creature that they had never seen, but whose presence they felt in every waking moment. The protocol, which had once been a source of terror, was now their only comfort. It was a shield, a set of rules that could protect them from the listening darkness. But it was a fragile shield, a thin, brittle barrier against a force that was growing stronger with each passing night. They knew that it was only a matter of time before the shield shattered, before the darkness broke through and consumed them. They were living on borrowed time. Two small, insignificant figures caught in a cosmic horror story that was far too big for them to comprehend. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were trying to stay sane. And in the face of a creature that fed on fear, that was a battle they were destined to lose. The power went out again. But this time it was different. The darkness was heavier, the silence more profound. It was a hungry, predatory darkness, a silence that was not just an absence of sound, but a presence, a living, breathing entity that was pressing in on them from all sides. Liam and Maya were in different parts of the facility, separated by a vast, dark ocean of silence. They both closed their eyes and began to count, their voices a small, trembling whisper in the overwhelming stillness. But this time, the sounds they heard were not just tapping or dragging. They heard voices, their own voices. The voices were whispering their deepest, most secret fears. Liam heard his father's voice, cold and disappointed, telling him that he would never amount to anything. He heard the voice of his ex-girlfriend, her words like daggers in his heart, telling him that he was unlovable, that he would always be alone. Maya heard her mother's voice, her tone sharp and critical, telling her that she was a failure, that she had wasted her potential. She heard the voice of her childhood bully, his laughter a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in the darkness of her mind. The voices were a symphony of self-doubt and self-loathing, a carefully orchestrated assault on their already fragile psyches. The listener was not just trying to scare them anymore. It was trying to break them. It was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each whispered word, each resurrected memory, each reopened wound. They were no longer just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their sanity. And in the deep, dark, listening silence of the archives, that was a battle that was becoming increasingly difficult to win. Liam, his mind a maelstrom of fear and self-loathing, made a decision. He was done being a victim. He was done being a pawn in a game he didn't understand. He was going to break the protocol. He was going to open his eyes. He knew it was a risk, a terrible, reckless gamble, but he couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't sit in the darkness and listen to the ghosts of his past tear him apart. He had to face it. He had to see it. He took a deep, shuddering breath and opened his eyes. The darkness was absolute, a thick, black curtain that seemed to swallow the light. But as his eyes adjusted, he began to see something. It was a shape, a form, a shifting, amorphous shadow that seemed to be made of pure darkness. It was coalescing around one of the archival shelves, a swirling vortex of blackness that was drawing the darkness of the room into itself. It was a hole in the world, a tear in the fabric of reality. It had no eyes, no face, no discernible features. But he could feel its gaze on him, a cold, invasive presence that seemed to be probing the deepest, most secret corners of his mind. He could feel it feeding on his fear, on his pain, on his despair. It was a parasite, and he was its host. The sight of it was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left him breathless and reeling. It was a thing of pure, unadulterated horror, a creature from a nightmare that had somehow crossed over into the waking world. But in the midst of his terror, he felt a strange, new emotion, anger. He was angry at the creature for what it had done to him, for what it had done to Maya, for what it had done to Ben. He was angry at Elias, at the facility, at the people who had put him in this position, who had sacrificed him to this thing. The anger was a fire in his belly, a hot, cleansing flame that burned away the fear and the self-doubt. He was not going to be a victim anymore. He was going to fight back. He didn't know how. He didn't know if it was even possible, but he was going to try. He was going to find Maya, and they were going to get out of this place, or die trying. Liam, now a target, a beacon of defiance in the listening darkness, began to move. He was no longer shuffling, no longer a timid, frightened mouse. He was a predator, a hunter, his every movement filled with a newfound purpose and determination. He had to get to Maya. He had to get them both out of this place. He navigated the darkened corridors with a speed and agility he didn't know he possessed. The layout of the facility, which had once been a source of anxiety, was now a weapon. He knew every corner, every hiding place, every shortcut. He was the ghost in the machine, a phantom in the darkness. The shadow thing, the creature that called itself the listener, was hunting him. He could feel its presence, a cold, cloying wrongness that seemed to be everywhere at once. He could hear it, a low, guttural growl that echoed in the silence, a sound of pure, frustrated rage. It was not used to being defied. It was not used to its prey fighting back. He used his knowledge of the facility to his advantage. He created diversions, knocking over shelves, setting off fire alarms, using the building's own systems against the creature that had made it its home. He was a guerrilla fighter, a saboteur, a one-man army against a force that was far beyond his comprehension. He was David, and this was his Goliath. He found Maya in the red zone, huddled in the corner of the safe room, her body trembling, her face pale with terror. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Liam," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken sound. "I heard it." I heard it in my head." "I know," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the swirling storm of her fear. "I saw it." He helped her to her feet, his hands strong and steady on her arms. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice filled with a conviction that he didn't entirely feel. Together. They stood at the door of the safe room, the two of them, two small, insignificant figures against a vast, dark, and hungry world. They were out of time. They were out of options. All they had left was each other in a desperate, reckless, and probably suicidal plan. They made their stand in the main lobby, a vast, open space with a high, vaulted ceiling and a wall of glass that looked out onto the sleeping city. It was a place of light, a place of connection to the outside world. It was the last place the creature would expect them to go. The shadow thing, the listener, followed them. It was a swirling vortex of darkness, a storm of rage and hunger that filled the lobby with its cold, malevolent presence. It was no longer hiding, no longer toying with them. It was here to feed. It was here to kill. Liam and Maya stood together, their backs against the cold, hard glass of the window. They were trapped, cornered, with nowhere left to run. The creature advanced on them, its form shifting and writhing, its low, guttural growl a symphony of terror. Liam looked at Maya, her face pale but resolute in the dim, emergency lighting. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a fierce, defiant courage that mirrored his own. They were not going to die cowering in a corner. They were going to die fighting. As the creature lunged at them, a swirling, chaotic mass of darkness and rage, Maya did something that Liam would never forget. She pushed him. She pushed him hard, sending him stumbling backwards, away from the creature, towards the emergency exit. "Run, Liam!" she screamed, her voice a raw, desperate cry that cut through the creature's growl. "Tell someone! Tell them what's here!" She turned to face the creature, her small, fragile body a defiant shield between Liam and the abyss. She spread her arms wide, a small, brave, and utterly hopeless gesture of defiance. The creature, its attention now focused entirely on her, enveloped her in its dark, swirling embrace. Her scream was a short, sharp, and terrible sound, a sound that would haunt Liam for the rest of his life. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, a sound that was cut off as quickly as it began. Liam, his mind a numb, screaming void, ran. He ran out the emergency exit, out into the cool, clean air of the night, the sound of Maya's final, terrible scream echoing in his ears. Liam made it out of the facility. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the cold, hard pavement of a deserted street, the city lights a blurry, indifferent smear against the dark, starless sky. He tried to tell them. He tried to tell the police, his supervisor, anyone who would listen. He told them about the darkness, about the whispers, about the creature that had taken Maya. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They saw a young man in shock, a kid who had cracked under the pressure of a stressful job. They saw a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown, a story that was too fantastic, too unbelievable to be true. He was fired, of course. Elias, his face a mask of cold, professional concern, had told him that he needed to get some rest, that he was clearly not cut out for the job. He had offered him a severance package, a small, insulting sum of money that was meant to buy his silence. Liam was alone. He was a pariah, a madman, a prophet of a truth that no one wanted to hear. He retreated to his small, cramped apartment, the blinds drawn, the doors locked, the world shut out. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He couldn't escape the memory of Maya's scream, the image of her small, defiant figure being consumed by the darkness. He could still hear the whispers. They were fainter now, a low, persistent hum in the back of his mind, but they were there. He knew that the listener was still out there, in the silence, in the darkness, waiting. He knew that it had not forgotten him. He had broken the protocol. He had seen its face, and it would never let him go. He now understood the true meaning of the protocol, the terrifying reality of what happens when the lights go out. It was not a set of rules for survival. It was a set of rules for a slow, agonizing, and inevitable death. And he was next.